Welcome to ThinkCast. I'm Kasey Panetta. Today on the podcast, we have Mike Rawlings, Distinguished VP Analyst with Gartner's Chief Data Officer Research Team, to talk about re-engineering the business decision. We'll talk about what that means, why it's crucial for organizations in 2021, and how to avoid making the biggest mistakes. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
So let's start with sort of the basic premise of this research and why are organizations struggling with effective decision-making?
Well, this has been a growing problem that if you think about the pace of business and think about how many things do we want to have a wider consideration for, that means that we're taking in a whole lot of new data and have the thought process of saying, boy, if we could just get our hands on this kind of data, we'd be able to have a lot better consideration for this particular kind of decision. But up to this point, we've been kind of hobbled with what's the data that we actually are collecting, and then the data that we're actually thinking, well, what's the specific insight that we want to create? And so our ability to look at a wide variety of considerations is a continuing challenge. But then the other part of the problem is that the decisions that we make have a bang-on effect to so many other things today, that as we start to look at how do we optimize at a next higher level, the impact of a decision can be far-reaching. It can reach within inside of our enterprise for production, to the way that we're thinking about our supply chain, to the way that we're thinking about how we're selling that, maybe even all the way back to design considerations that we have for our product, and also with our greater ecosystem of partners. So the impact of decisions is also much greater. The final piece is what everybody feels, which is the pace. So the cadence in which we're making decisions starts to really blur the lines between strategic, tactical, and operational. Back in hierarchical kind of days, we would say that, strategy was made on high, and then the tactical decisions were made, and then operational decisions were made, and they were generally made by different groups and different people. But the blurring of the lines between all of these things means that you're thinking about all of these at once, and that the impact of your decision can affect any one of them. So that combination of the wider set of considerations, the impact and the bang-on effect of the actual decisions that you're making, and also the speed at which you're making them, the blurring of the lines between those three things, those are what's making us say, you know what, decision-making isn't as effective as what it could be.
The big term is re-engineer the decision. So what does that mean in practice?
Fundamentally, it means rethinking the way that you're making decisions. That if you feel those impacts, the things that are causing decision-making to be ineffective, the fact that you want to have that decision be connected to other decisions that you're making, that you're really using context to understand what's the situation, what is the best thing that we could do given these circumstances, and that you're starting to look at how do we make this combination of strategic, tactical, operational, and continuous process, how do we make sure that our ability to respond is built into that decisioning? One thing that we really believe is true around re-engineering the decision is that first, we need to assume a degree of augmentation. We need to think of this as everything from decision support, providing just some data as an input, all the way up to automated decisioning. And we have to start rethinking that role between humans and machines, certainly not to replace humans, but to actually realize that we can be complemented by the power of data, analytics, and artificial intelligence in our decision-making. And we can consider a wide range of things that we couldn't have considered before, but we need to do that by thinking about what's the best role for each within inside of this decisioning process and practice, and how are we going to achieve that?
I want to pause quickly to talk about how leaders can learn to make better decisions for their own organizations with Gartner's eBook that dives into the details of re-engineering the decision and more. Visit the ThinkCast page for this episode on Gartner.com for a download link. This is a really big concept that is going to affect all pieces of the business, but what was the impetus to actually doing this research?
There's several folks inside of the data analytics team here at Gartner that have been thinking about this in some frame for a very long time. We're talking 10, 15 years of thinking about things like how do we make an insight-oriented play with inside of enterprises? How do we make sure that we're able to bring the latest data that is relevant to a decision into someone's frame of consideration? When you start to look at that insight provisioning, you then add in there artificial intelligence and how that's really come to be within the last several years, where you're now able to take advantage of a wide range of ways of interpreting data and bringing that forward for people to consider. You have our decision-making research. We've been looking at this for a very long time. Everything from business process management and the attention to how do you actually structure decisioning. And then you bring in data fabric work, which is some of our most latest work where we're talking about how do you create an infrastructure that doesn't just look at the interconnections between data that we engineer on purpose, but actually can look at applying analytics to our metadata to actually start building some of those things autonomously. And then you take the consideration of the pandemic and you start to look at how a lot of the things that we were doing were based on ideas of things just being in a good status quo. And then you have the pandemic come along and upset supply chains, for instance, and other things. So that means that we're now in a position where uncertainty is more the rule than not. As a result, we have to think of how do you start to account for that? Then you have the future of applications work and the future of data analytics work that we've recently published over the course of the last year. And that combines into something that says, you know what? Not only should we be recommending that re-engineering the decision occur, but we also have the capability to do that. And that's a big difference. It's not just research that says, you know, this is an interesting idea for you to consider. This is something that people are doing and that you have the capability of doing.
So I want to go back to something that you mentioned towards the beginning of the interview, which is the idea of these connected, contextual, and continuous decisions. And all of these lead to decisions that share 4 characteristics. So can you talk about those 4 characteristics for us?
So the 4 characteristics of decisioning is at first, highly optimized decisions. With a highly optimized decision, that's where you're able to look at supply chain issues and their interconnectedness with other things and optimize at a much higher level than what you had expected before. The consideration process lets you refine that decision so that it takes into account the challenges that it might create for you with inside of other areas of your business. A highly optimized decision allows you to bring those considerations to the forefront. Next, we have highly automated and augmented decisions. And this is where we realize that there's a new relationship that we can establish that's very symbiotic between humans and machines and taking the advantage of both and the things that we have best to offer. Doing so in a way, we can go from providing some input to a decision all the way up to automated decisioning. The next one is highly future fit decision. If we're considering a much broader context, how they're connected with other things, and we're also thinking about the kinds of collaborations that we have to have, we're building a decisioning approach that is very future fit because it starts to anticipate uncertainty. It starts to bring in the true role of uncertainty in our decisioning, where we may have convinced ourselves that it's not a whole lot of uncertainty in that decision process, but in the reality, it really does benefit from that ability to understand other kinds of data, other types of inputs, look at various scenarios. That's a very rich future fit decision. And the fourth element is highly composable decisions. This comes from the work with the future of applications and also the future of data and analytics, where you want to combine different elements, pieces of application logic, different data and analytics endeavors. You want to be able to easily recompose these different elements so that we can create highly future fit decisions, more optimized decisions, highly automated and augmented decisions. So all of these work together to re-engineer a decision.
Let's talk about the actual business impacts here. What are the benefits of this type of thinking about decisions? More importantly, what are organizations risking when they're not thinking like this?
Well, I think we have some great lessons from the pandemic that if you look at supply chains being affected by all of a sudden we have a situation that causes either a gigantic spike in our supply chain, or maybe it's a total erosion of our ability to fulfill because all kinds of different partners have been affected. We saw a lot of different algorithms having to be redone for supply chain planning because they didn't account for uncertainty. So if you think about that with inside of your own business, with inside of your own agency, if you're in the public sector, it's really about starting to build things that actually reflect reality, not just have a view that we can somehow control reality. Part of the challenge with not doing things according to saying what parts of our business need to be re-engineered, what parts should we rethink the various kinds of inputs to give us a better perspective of what's happening and start to be able to plan out with scenarios different ways forward. If you're not doing that, then you're just letting reality happen to you. The benefits is that you're actually creating something that allows you to account for more of the actual things happening than what you may have otherwise. A risk, all we have to do is look at what happened to organizations that didn't have, future fit decisioning as part of their play during the pandemic.
For organizations who maybe recognize this as an issue or are just starting to realize that they need to change how they're thinking, basically organizations that aren't very mature at this point, what is the first step they need to think about or to take so they can kind of get back on the right path?
Well, many organizations have only begun their data-driven journey. And when we talk about becoming a data-driven enterprise, we're not just talking about using data in decision-making. We've been doing that since the days of stone tablets. When you think about what does data-driven actually mean to your organization, that's one of those questions that your executive team needs to consider and say, how do we really want to incorporate data and analytics into literally everything that we do? What's the kind of opportunities that we have that if we could just get our hands on this kind of data or this type of insight, that if we could create this particular kind of data or get it from a third party somewhere on the planet, how could we fundamentally change what we do? And so when you start to examine those kind of questions, your executive team certainly needs to be involved to set that vision for what does it really mean to become a data-driven enterprise. But it's also the role of the chief data officer. We've been seeing this role expand over the last several years. And as a result, the chief data officer is the accountable executive for data and analytics. If you don't have an organizational focus on data analytics, maybe it's time that you think about how you develop that in earnest so that you bring together a number of different pieces of the puzzle, treating data analytics as assets, have an intentional way of creating value with them, be able to rethink your data analytics strategy as more of a business strategy that is infused with data analytics thinking. The governance, the skills and competencies, and data literacy necessary for your organization. How are you addressing these big things and making sure that you're able to implement that along with then thinking about what areas of your business, what areas of your public sector organization have these characteristics where you really need to have that broader frame of consideration, and then starting in earnest and examining how do we start to pull that apart and decide which pieces are most appropriate for that symbiotic human and machine partnership.
Let's take a quick break to talk about how you can learn more about data and analytics. From governance and customer privacy protections to fact-based decision-making, data and analytics leaders must anticipate changes and shift quickly to ensure the success of their organizations. Get the insights you need at the virtual Gartner Data and Analytics Summit. For more information on our conference schedule, visit Gartner.com. As organizations start to really think about reimagining their relationship with data and how all these things are going to work together, what are the biggest mistakes that you've seen or that they can avoid?
One of the biggest mistakes is where you start to be hobbled by your own thoughts about your maturity inside of your organization with respect to data analytics. What I mean by that is that maturity models are great at telling you where you are, but they're not great at telling you where you need to go. With a strategy, with a thought out strategy about your vision, what stakeholder outcomes do we really want to try to affect? What kind of ways are we going to use data analytics to do that? When you're thinking in that kind of a way, you actually start to say, well, gosh, we may not have a capability with inside of data science, but we have such a rich opportunity in this space. maybe we need to really accelerate our way of developing those competencies and skills. But if you looked at it purely from a maturity standpoint, you might convince yourself that, oh gosh, we're a 1 or we're a 1.5 on this 1 to 5 scale. And that means that we really aren't prepared to do that. So we really shouldn't even think about that. And I think that those kind of thoughts are really self-limiting to not only individuals, but to organizations as a whole. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that one can make. Is you have to think about what is your vision, what is our strategy, and then go with earnest after that opportunity.
One thing I want to circle back to that you mentioned earlier before we get to our final thoughts is part of this reimagination, rethinking means using new technology to automate or augment pieces of these decisions. But it doesn't mean removing humans altogether. And it doesn't mean that technology is going to solve all the problems, right?
Of course not. Because we can see that technology, even in our decades of use, hasn't corrected all of our problems. That's definitely not the role. But, a simple example, if you think about like natural language processing, the ability to pick through and understand and then start to summarize vast volumes of information that you're starting to interpret the meaning with inside of that. How long would it take an individual to read, 500 different documents as part of consideration for a decision that they're getting ready to make? This is one of those areas where by using technology and by augmenting that decision, by having summarization and other things, you can start to understand and interpret what's happening without necessarily reading it all yourself. That's just one example. Also, when you start to talk about, think of an Internet of Things kind of environment where you've created a digital twin of your manufacturing floor. You have constant flow of signals from every single piece of machinery on that floor. You're able to see what's going on at a high level. But if you had to interpret that constant flow of data yourself, you'd never be able to do it. Let's take advantage of that capability. But let's also remember that humans have things like the emotional construct. You're talking with a customer and you have a next best action that's recommended in a list. Doesn't mean pick the one on top just because it has the higher priority. It's pick the thing that actually is in tune with that other human on the line. So we have things, ethical consideration, all kinds of capabilities that machines do not have. Let's make sure that we pair up those two together to take the most advantage that we possibly can. That allows us to really take advantage of technology in a very thoughtful way, as opposed to thinking that machines can do everything.
Well, that seems like a good place to finish. Do you have any final thoughts to share with our audience?
Final thought is just don't wait. The final thought is that this is not science fiction. These are things that organizations are doing today, ways that they're accounting for a much richer context, the way that they're making decisions in a much more collaborative manner. These are things that you can do. This is not something that you have to wait and think that we'll wait until it gets proved out. I'd say start down this road, start looking, especially in areas where you see that the world has made it much more connected, contextual, and continuous, and find those opportunities where you need to put your effort.
Gartner ThinkCast is a production of Gartner, the world's leading research and advisory company, equipping executives across the enterprise with indispensable insights, advice, and tools to achieve their mission-critical priorities. You can learn more at Gartner.com. All content in Gartner ThinkCast is owned by Gartner and cannot be repurposed or reproduced without Gartner's consent. Gartner is an impartial, independent analyst of business and technology. This content should not be construed as a Gartner endorsement of any enterprise's products or services. All content provided by other speakers is expressly the views of those speakers and their organizations.